Today we are going to be talking about regulatory requirements focusing on the NPDES permit system, OSHA, and safety. As you know, we're from the Southwest Environmental Finance Center, UNM School of Engineering here in New Mexico, and we are working on this particular project with our friends at the Hugo Wall Public School of Affairs, School of Public Affairs, Heartland Environmental Justice System, and Wichita State's Environmental Finance Center. My name is James Markham. You may recognize me from, I think, the first one in this series. And with me today, as always, is Matt Ziegler, our Director of Tribal Programs. And on the note of tribal programs, our wastewater program that is funding this training has technical assistance attached to it as well. It is basically covering EPA regions 6, 7, and 8, all the states that are listed there. We have a lot of training and technical assistance that is available, so you can always reach out to us for assistance, pretty much whatever your needs are. And if we can't come up with an answer or provide help, we'll typically be able to find someone who can. We do a lot of different things in the tribal world: needs assessments, technical assistance for funding, TMF capacity, peer-to-peer learning. So we're a great resource, as are our partners. So when in doubt, reach out and we will try to do our best to help you. Obviously, this whole series is about operator certification, and you can't operate most wastewater treatments facilities without a license. And of course, as we mentioned, the licensing requirements are based typically on facility technology and the population size served. And then there are some additional requirements, including passing the exam, which hopefully this series will help you do. Again, you're in a lot of different areas under different jurisdictions. There are many different agencies that do wastewater certification. There are individual state programs. There's ITCA, the Intertribal Council of Arizona, the United Southern and Eastern Tribes have their own certification. There's really no national EPA tribal wastewater program or certification program. So which of these exams you're going to take is going to depend largely on who the regulatory and enforcement agencies are, where you're at, and so this is kind of a general overview of issues that you are going to potentially come up with on exams. Obviously, there are some variations and we can't cover everything, but we'll be talking mostly about the federal regulations and giving you some insight into potential state regulations and things that you might have to pay attention to for the certification process. Of course, as always, we encourage you to make use of all of the training materials that are out there. This happens to be some Oklahoma information. There are need-to-know guides. You need to really check with the licensing agency website for whoever you're going to be taking the exam for, because they will have specifics about their specific course, particularly when it comes to today's topic, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or at least the first half of today's project, which is typically a smaller part of the exam. There's usually not a lot of questions on it, but it is a little bit complicated, and it is really important, particularly for tribal operators, to understand how the NPDES system works, because for the most part, in fact, pretty much across the board, as far as I know, the EPA basically handles NPDES permitting on tribal land, and they handle it in about half of the states directly. And in other states, as we'll see, the states have primacy and have the ability to do that. But if you're doing surface water discharge, it's going to be being done under an NPDES permit. It's really an important part of understanding sort of the legal framework for wastewater discharges. So even though there typically are only a few questions on the exams about it, it is a really important subject for you to know about for your career and for the safe and continued operation of the facility that you work at. Obviously, like I said, we can't show every state certifying agency's website, but this is just kind of an example. And it's good to know the laws and the legal framework of the area that you're working in. Many of these sites have study guides. We've kind of pointed these out before. Oklahoma study guide can be found online, and typically the NPDES, OSHA, and safety pieces fall in the regulations parts of these study guides. So what you're going to be tested on and the degree to which you're going to be tested on will be kind of listed in the need to knows, but typically this stuff falls under the regulations. And you can see here in Oklahoma, in the monitoring, sampling, and reporting requirements, those are covered in Chapter 3. The need to knows from Texas have it in a slightly different place. But this whole point here is that you really need to know the basic laws and rules that grant authority to the agency that is regulating you and really understand the framework that the permit is issued under so that you can make sure that you remain compliant with it. Again, a lot of the resources were covered in the earlier sessions, but it's good, again, to check with the individual websites to see what you are going to be responsible for the exam and in your job. So most, if not all states, tribal lands, and have some sort of regulations or laws pertaining to or protecting their waters. You might have state regulations covering groundwater discharges from a lagoon like this. You may have specific tribal regulations, but although every state and tribal nation has typically specific laws related to water protection, the permitting system that we're going to be talking about today, NPDES, has its origins in federal law and regulations. Those cover discharges into our nation's waterways from specific points. We'll get into what that exactly means here in a minute. And the whole idea is that when you have an outflow like this one, which happens to be a system we work with in Texas, that flows out into a river, we want to make sure that the water going into that body of water is safe, what's coming out of the plant. And so in practical terms, what that means is you as an operator or someone taking the certification exam and running the plant really need to understand the basics of federal and state regimes to see how they work together in your particular location, because it varies from location to location. But we're going to focus, like I said, mostly on the federal regulations today. A little bit of history, right? These federal laws are very much the result of this particular event and other ones like it. This is the 1969 Cuyahoga River fire. And this particular fire happened right at the time that America was really starting to pay attention to environmental issues, when our national consciousness was being raised about a whole host of dangerous practices, not the least of which was the dumping of toxic chemicals directly into rivers. Between this fire and 1868, so in about a 100-year span, there were at least 13 documented fires on a river. So it kind of became the poster child for the environmental era, and that spurred really an avalanche of water pollution protection regulations. So the Clean Water Act, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and actually the creation of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency itself, all kind of sparked off, if you don't mind the term, by this particular incident and other ones like it. The legal framework around the Clean Water Act and the regulations that we're going to really be talking about today is an evolving framework. It started in '72 with the passage of the Clean Water Act, and you can see a timeline there on the right-hand side going up to 2003. This is always in flux because a lot of the regulations are based on available technologies. So rules change over time as sort of interest in environmental issues waxes and wanes. But you can see, secondary treatment regulations put in the early '70s. There were amendments in '77. Pre-treatment program rules started in '78. There were amendments again in '81. Stormwater was added in the '90s. Secondary treatment regulations were added. And confined animal feeding was actually brought into this mix in the early 2000s. So it's an evolving set of laws and regulations, but the purpose here is to make sure that a lot of businesses like wastewater treatment plants work under a framework that keeps the public safe, and it is working. This diagram here on the right-hand side shows a comparison from before and after the Clean Water Act. And you can see before the Clean Water Act, there was actually significant raw water discharge straight into surface water, and less than secondary treatment made up probably close to about a third of all of the discharges. And then pretty much the highest level of treatment was secondary treatment. Whereas after the Clean Water Act, raw water discharges have been pretty much eliminated. There's very little less than secondary treatment, and greater than secondary treatment has actually become quite a big piece of the puzzle. So the good news is, although this framework is somewhat complicated, it's actually working. It's doing what it's supposed to. So if you look at the Cuyahoga River now, it looks something a lot like this. Obviously, these improvements didn't happen overnight, but the Clean Water Act and similar legislation, both at the federal and state levels, have really reduced organic waste discharges into the nation's rivers by about 98%. So Cuyahoga River does not catch fire anymore. It looks like this. People get to enjoy it. It's a lot safer place to be, as are the rest of our nation's waterways. So a little bit of history there, but is kind of useful. Sometimes the origination date of the Clean Water Act 1972 pops up on exams. So with that out of the way, let's shift to the main law, Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments, commonly referred to as the Clean Water Act, which were passed in 72, and those actually established the permit program that we're going to be talking about today. The purpose was to basically restore and maintain chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. That was kind of the summary of the goal. There were a lot of sort of more discrete goals here. Idea was that they were going to get national water standards by about 83, eliminate pollutants in navigable waterways by 85, eliminate the discharge of toxic pollutants in toxic amounts, provide financial assistance to publicly owned treatment works, develop wastewater treatment management planning and control processes in each state. Again, this was a national approach. And then there were components around research and development to eliminate those discharges and developing and implementing programs to control point and non-point sources of pollution, although most of what we're going to be talking about today are point discharges, which I will define in a moment. So preliminary or primary elements of the Clean Water Act, set of minimum national effluent standards based on available treatment technology. So again, these are evolving standards over time as treatment technologies improve and we can do a better job. Generally, there are rulemaking processes to lower the acceptable amount of pollutants. So over time, over your career, you're likely to see minimum standards go down a little bit or improve, if you want to think of it that way. Other elements, having a water quality standard system, obviously the creation of the NPDES permit program itself, which provides enforceable limitations on dischargers. You can't discharge without a permit, and every permit has very specific criteria listed in it that say what you can and cannot do and what reporting you have to do. There are also special provisions for things like toxic chemicals and oil discharges. And last but not least, we mentioned this before, the construction and loan programs for publicly owned treatment works, which you're probably familiar with as the Clean Water State Revolving Fund program, is a direct result of the Clean Water Act itself. And again, those regulations are there to avoid this kind of thing, trying to avoid sewer spills, river fires, dead rivers, things like that, and the less obvious impacts of unregulated discharges that we might not necessarily see. And it is worth pointing out that the Clean Water Act covers a lot more than just municipal wastewater treatment discharges, but for the purposes of today, that's really what we're going to focus on in our discussion. So let's talk about the permit regulations themselves. Again, this is going to be a broad overview of the permit systems and regulations, which are administered generally by the EPA, although, and we'll see in some cases, state agencies are responsible for that. But in either case, what they're focused on are surface water discharges. So most of the regulations implementing the Clean Water Act are found in 40 CFR 122 and the later sections. CFR is Code of Federal Regulations. And those regs were established to basically deal with this, right? You can't discharge pollutants, which is a defined term, from a point source, which is a defined term, into waters of the United States, which is another defined term, without an NPDES permit. So let's go through what those three defined terms actually mean so that you really understand the applicability of these regs to wastewater treatment. So first off, pollutant. It's really broadly defined in the Clean Water Act and includes any type of industrial, municipal, or agricultural waste discharged into water. And I've got municipal highlighted there because that's the part that makes it applicable to wastewater facilities. Though, as you can see, again, it's got a much broader application than just wastewater treatment. Another key term is this concept of a point source. So it's defined as any discernible, confined, and discrete conveyance, such as a pipe, a ditch, a channel, a tunnel, a conduit, a discrete fissure, or a container. The idea here is that what this is regulating is discharges coming from a specific place, like out of a pipe or out of a ditch. It's not going to cover, for example, agricultural runoff that may work its way from a field into a water body. Those aren't point sources. But something like a tunnel or a channel or an effluent conduit, like I showed you from our system that we work with in Texas, that is a point source. It's a specific place where you can say, basically, those discharges are coming out here as opposed to sort of leaching across the land. Some common point sources that you see, sewer overflows, combined sewer overflows, for example. So the city of San Francisco has a situation like this where their stormwater and wastewater systems are actually combined. And in heavy storm events, sometimes the stormwater actually overflows the wastewater treatment plants or overwhelms them. So, the discharge from a combined sewer overflow would be considered a point source. Same thing, the discharge from a treatment plant or a stormwater system. As I mentioned, they added concentrated animal feeding operations in the early 2000s. There are also a lot of non-municipal point sources from industries, and in some cases, construction stormwater, and actually even discharges directly out of a vessel, for example, into a lake or into a bay. Those are point sources. So again, point source is basically a specific point where the discharge happens, as opposed to something like agricultural discharges where return flows, like over an irrigated pasture, eventually work their way into the water. Which brings us to our last definition, water of the United States, which is, again, kind of a weird term. It's really broadly defined in the Clean Water Act. And after about 25, actually, it's a lot more than that, years of litigation, because litigation on this topic is ongoing. Basically, what it means is navigable waters and tributaries to navigable waters, interstate waters and the oceans out to 200 miles, and intrastate waters. So basically, if you can put a boat in it, there's a good chance it probably counts as navigable waters. There are some inconsistent court decisions. This is sort of the ongoing subject of regulatory and legal debate. The most recent revisions happened in 2023, I believe. Of course, for the exam, nobody's going to expect you to be up on all the most recent case law, but the idea is that, waters of the United States are those navigable waters and tributaries and interstate waters that we all share. So the Clean Water Act has really broad application in terms of surface water, but what it doesn't really include is groundwater, although, as we'll see, a lot of states regulate that side of things. But we'll get to that in the latter half of this first part of our session. So let's talk about discharge permitting and what's actually in a permit. So you can't discharge into waters of the United States without a permit. So that's step one. All permits have minimum levels of treatment based on secondary treatment processes. So as we'll see, we'll show you a table here in a little bit, there are going to be minimum standards that you are required to meet. They may actually have other limitations to protect water quality. Those are typically very sort of site and process specific and may depend on, the status of the body of water that you are discharging into, or the specific processes or the specific pollutants that your particular system has to deal with. So in addition to sort of the general standards, there may be some specific standards. Typically, they allow for self-testing. This is one of those things where you get your permit, you do the monitoring and testing yourself, and then you have to report those results periodically back to the agency that issued the permit. So permits last 5 years. It's kind of a key thing to remember. Also, one of those questions that often pops up: how often do you have to renew a permit? It's every 5 years, and this is really important. It's on the utility to renew that permit. So whether your permit is issued by a state agency that has primacy or the EPA, they are not going to check in with you at year 4.5 to make sure that you're on track to get your permit renewed. It's entirely on the permittee to make sure that that process happens in a timely and smooth manner. So again, something to remember, keeping track of when your permit expires and getting your renewal application in is entirely on the permittee. Test results for that self-testing and self-monitoring that you do are typically reported quarterly on what's called a DMR, or discharge monitoring report. And we'll look at one of those here in a few minutes so that you have an idea of what's on there. One of the things about the permit process, when they give you the permit, they also reserve the right to inspect your treatment works and actually to collect samples to verify your compliance. So it's kind of a trust but verify sort of situation. At any time, the agency can stop by, take samples, and make sure that what you're reporting is actually what's happening on the ground. And it's important to make sure that you are actually reporting the correct information and not fudging the details, because there are significant fines associated with permit violations or forged documents, and there's also potential for criminal prosecution here. So this is one of those things where it's better to report a bad outcome than not to report an outcome or to fudge the numbers. You really don't want to be messing with this stuff. As I pointed out, the surface water discharge permits under the NPDES program might come from the EPA or might come from a state agency that's been granted authority to administer the programs. Some states have this, some don't, some have partial authority. Tribal land is typically administered directly by the EPA. And again, just to reiterate, you can get inspected by whoever issued your permit pretty much at any time. So you want to make sure that you're following your permit requirements, that you understand what they are, and that you're reporting the correct information, because I didn't know is not acceptable as an answer for why something did not get turned in. So let's start with the first of those things. We talked about minimum discharge quality limits. So basically the regs associated with this statute lay out specific discharge effluent quality limits. So the ones I've got highlighted here, for example, are for biological oxygen demand, BOD in particular. So when you're operating your system, your 30-day average can't exceed 30 milligrams per liter, and your 7-day average can't exceed 45 milligrams per liter. This is often referred to as the 30-45 rule. That's kind of the background situation that everybody is operating under. That being said, things can be a little bit more stringent. Instead of using BOD, NPDES authority can use CBOD, excuse me. And if you look at the numbers below there, those are actually a little bit more stringent. It's 25-40 instead of 30-45. And so as you look through your permit, look for sort of the standard items that are going to be listed, which are going to basically be BOD, suspended solids, and pH, but there may be several other things as well. We've put together a little table for you. Not a bad idea to memorize these 30 and 7-day average numbers for these different criteria, because they often pop up. Again, BOD, TSS, total suspended solids, those have the same basic averages. It's 30-45. Fecal chloroform is a number count. So 500 organisms per 100 milliliters on the 30-day average. And you can see some of these don't have 7-day averages, and some of these factors like pH and total residual chlorine just have mins and maxes that you have to meet. So the pH of the effluent coming out of the treatment plant has to be somewhere between 6 and 9, and total residual chlorine basically has to be non-detectable or virtually zero. These are the basics. These are going to show up on everybody's permit, but you may have other criteria, including nitrates, total nitrogen, and a variety of other pollutants that you may specifically have to track based on your particular situation. So this is an example.
You have to refrigerate it at that for that much longer.
Oops, somebody's unmuted. So this is an example of a permit with some testing periods and limits. And you can see in this case at the bottom, we've got CBOD instead of regular BOD. And they've got at the top, the specific parameters that they have to track. In this case, they have to track mercury and sulfides and total ammonia. And on the right-hand side, it tells you what kind of sample method has to be used. So again, pretty much everything we talk about today regarding NPDES discharge permits is going to be found in your specific permit as well. So I highly recommend, if you haven't taken a look at it, to do so at some point. So again, you know exactly what you're responsible for testing, and you know the time frame for both the testing and the reporting for those individual parameters, because they are different, as we will see. So you've got a bunch of tests you have to take, there's sampling that you have to do, and you have to do the reporting. So this is how we basically verify to the agency that gave us the permit that everything's working the way it's supposed to, or at least that we're aware that things aren't working the way they're supposed to. The sample collection and analytical results required by your permit are going to be recorded, again, quarterly on a discharge monitoring report, DMR. This is whether your enforcement authority is the state or EPA. There's going to be some reporting requirements, and they will vary by parameter. This is what a typical DMR looks like. As you can see at the top, areas 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all basically identifiers for the facility: address, facility location, permit number, and discharge number. 5 is basically the monitoring period that you're going to cover. 7 is where the parameters would be listed. Over on columns 8 basically tells you the sample type, the frequency of the analysis, and then at the bottom is basically where the appropriate authority at the plant signs off and indicates the date when this happened and that this is all true. So I do want to point out number 6 up there, where it says check here if no discharge. If you have a monitoring, an NPDES permit, even if you don't have discharges, you're still responsible for the testing, and you're still responsible for the reporting. So there are a lot of systems that have both an NPDES permit and perhaps a state groundwater discharge permit, because either at different times of the year or under different flow levels, sometimes they discharge to surface water and sometimes they discharge to groundwater. In those cases, there's one just south of here in New Mexico that almost never actually discharges under their permit, but they're still responsible for doing the appropriate tests and filing the paperwork on a quarterly basis to basically verify compliance. Column 8B there is kind of interesting, because that is where they list the frequency of analysis for each individual sample or parameter that you have to sample. And it uses a numerical code. Again, this is unlikely to come up on the exam, but it is a really good thing to be aware of and to know, so that you can interpret your permit correctly. And basically the way it works is the first number in the code is the frequency, and the second number in the code is the time period. So 0107 means once every 7 days or weekly. 0114, once every 14 days or 2 weeks. 0330 would be 3 times in a 30-day period, or 3 times in a month. So again, this will be on the permit. There is a code there as well, or a decoder, so to speak, there as well. But this is a good thing to just understand and verify and make sure that you are complying with, because again, it does frequency of analysis is specific to each individual permit. And if you move from one facility to another, things may change. You can't rely on the frequency of analysis of the last permit you had at a different facility, or possibly even the same facility, because things change. And if you have an enforcement action or something like that in place, that could also change the frequency of analysis and even possibly the frequency of reporting. So good to be able to decode these things. Discharge permits also specify the reporting dates, so they'll tell you exactly when your reports are due. And what's really important to remember about all of this is that the DMR results, everything that you're reporting, go into a public database. So, it's like that old saying, everything goes down on your permanent record. The reported results get compared to your current permit limits or enforcement order limits, if there is one in place. And once again, it's all in a public database. It's in the ECHO database. I'll show you that here in a second. So remember, another reason for being compliant with all of this stuff is that, paperwork errors, not filing reports, those count as violations and those show up in the database as well. So ideally, you want the public record to reflect what you're actually doing. So focus on getting the samples taken on time, getting the reporting done on time. And again, just don't forget, DMRs are required even if you did not have a discharge in the reporting period. What I'm really kind of getting at here is you want those DMRs to be accurate. You want them to be timely. You want them to be legible. You don't want anybody making a mistake putting that information into the database, and you want them to be complete. And again, timing for submissions might vary a little bit. For example, in Oklahoma, it's required on the 10th day of the month following the end of the quarter. So if it's, March 31st is the end of the quarter, the report's due April 10th. Your particular jurisdiction may be a little different, but again, it's gonna be in the permit. So that's kind of the source for all information. And if for some reason there's something that is unclear or you're not sure about, you can always give your compliance officer a call and talk to them about what is necessary. A lot of the EPA regions have, and most states have, some sort of a handbook that will give you some basic information about reporting requirements. This one happens to be the book for EPA Region 6. And it's a little bit of a problem because it's hard to find. It pops up on the EPA website and then they do revamps and then it disappears and then it comes back. I actually looked for it under the last URL I had yesterday and couldn't find it. And now it's under this long URL that's listed at the bottom. That being said, you could just Google, EPA NPDES reporting requirements, and wherever it happens to be should pop up in the Google search. I will also note that they haven't even updated the cover of this book. The URL that's listed on the cover is wrong, but it's got the basic information in there. But again, this is largely redundant to what's going to be in your permit as well. So we talked about what you got to do when things are going right? You're taking your samples, everything's going well, you're doing your monitoring. There are certain events that you cannot wait on reporting for. So for example, if you have a bypass or an overflow or an upset at your treatment facility, you have 24 hours to report to the appropriate agency that that happened. You've got 24 hours to let them know things went wrong. The initial report can be made orally. The EPA and most states have a specific hotline or phone number for this. That being said, once you've made the oral report, you are not done. You have to file a written submission within 5 days of the event actually happening. There may be other additional specific reporting requirements with their own schedules. Like I said, in your permit, you might have progress reports that you have to comply with, particularly if you're under an enforcement action. Usually those are identify a problem and have specific steps to remedy that issue. So you may be required to submit progress reports to demonstrate that you are working your way out of that enforcement order. You might have pre-treatment requirements. There may be specific toxicity reports related to specific pollutants that are at your system that you have to deal with. There's also an entire set of regulations dealing with sludge disposal and stormwater. So again, there's a lot of things that the Clean Water Act covers. Everything that is applicable to you will be covered in the permit or enforcement action or actions that your utility is currently working under. So again, familiarize yourself with those, particularly if you're sort of a chief operator at a place. But in my opinion, pretty much everybody working at a utility should know what the permit requires, because again, that's how we keep ourselves honest. If you're in one of those states that has partial primacy or complete primacy, you may actually have other specific reports that you have to file. So for example, Oklahoma has monthly operational reports that utilities are required to file. They've got primacy in this area. And one of the interesting things about that is the EPA and the regs set the minimum standards. If a state has taken over this enforcement and regulation with the EPA's approval, there's nothing that prevents them from setting more stringent standards. Just like with cars and gas mileage requirements and emissions in California, where they're always much lower than the federal requirements, individual states may have more stringent requirements than the basic minimums that are set out in the federal regulations, which is again another good reason to understand both the federal scheme and whatever may be applicable to you in your state scheme as well. So other types of things that you might have if you do land application, most of the plants in New Mexico, wastewater treatment plants, actually do groundwater discharge. So they have land application, and they've got a whole set of documents that they're required to file on a monthly basis. On a quarterly basis, but they track monthly. Regarding a land application. So again, this is one of those things, there's way too many states in the area that this training is covering to list them all here. But if you have a state permit that covers your plant, it's a very good idea to again read that, understand specifically what is covered, and if you're taking a state-specific wastewater treatment exam as opposed to, for example, the IDCA exam, make sure that you cover and look over the state requirements, because those are usually tested with at least one or two questions in the exam itself. As I mentioned, you are responsible for both reporting when things are going well and when they're not. If you have a permit requirement that you do not comply with, you are required to report it. Individual permits may even have specific requirements for reporting anticipated non-compliance. So if there's a flow limit and you've got an idea that that's going to be exceeded because of events that are happening, you may actually have to report that on an anticipatory basis, i.e. we think this is going to happen based on X, Y, and Z. And again, things like upsets, overflows, things that might endanger health of the environment, you've got that 24-hour reporting requirement. Typically for those bigger events, you have to let the appropriate authorities know within at least a 24-hour period that it has happened. Most jurisdictions have a non-compliance report that you would use to fill that out. Again, this is the EPA Region 6's version. Your specific regions may differ slightly, but basically you're going to be telling them what facility it is, what permit number it is, what parameter you're non-compliant about, what the value is, what your limit is, when it happened, how long it happened. So if it's like a multi-day kind of event, duration of that violation, what the cause was, and most importantly, what you're going to do about it. What is the corrective action that you took or are taking to remedy this problem? That's really important. Also really important just in general, your system should have up-to-date copies of every form that you might be required to submit. So, again, another good reason to go through your permit, see which things you have to submit on what schedules, and make sure that you've got copies of those forms, because the last thing you want to do is, have an event like a sewer system overflow or sewer plant overflow, and be running around looking for the form that you need while you're trying to fix the problem. So again, good idea to be clear on what paperwork you need and make sure you've got copies of all of that so that as a practical matter, if you ever have to submit one, you at least don't have to spend time looking for the form. Because again, not having the form or not knowing that there is one is not an excuse for non-submittal. So again, these are kind of the things just listed in tabular form of what you're going to have to include in those non-compliance reports. And again, the big one is the corrective action and the impact, i.e., what was the outcome of this issue and how are you going to fix it? Like I said, all of this stuff goes down on the permanent record, which is held in the ECHO database, EPA's enforcement and compliance history online. Whether you are sending information to a state agency that has primacy or directly to the EPA, it all ends up in the same place. It's public information. The general public can look up any system in the country, look at the publicly available data about whether the permittee is in compliance, what's included in those monitoring reports, locations of discharges, what pollutants they're discharging, types and amounts. All of that stuff is publicly available. This is what it looks like if you haven't taken a look at it. And if you haven't, I encourage you to, sometime when you're surfing the web, look up ECHO, EPA ECHO, and look up your particular utility to see whether the information is correct, but to get an idea of what you're on the hook for and how well you're doing. Again, it's all public information, so there's really multiple incentives here for doing the right thing. This happens to be the City of Albuquerque's report. I think this is from 2023, but this is what the pages look like. So it basically tells you when the permit was issued, when it expired. In this case, you can see the expiration date up there was 11/30/24. I am 99.99% sure that Albuquerque renewed its permit on time, but if it hadn't, that would be up here. It would say that it was expired. So good thing, again, to look at. You can kind of review your entire reporting history here, see if you're under any enforcement orders, look at the specifics. Good thing to know because, again, the public has access to this. As I mentioned, there are some significant penalties are tied up with Clean Water Act violations. A person who knowingly makes false statements, representations, or certifications or that was material in any document filed or maintained under the Clean Water Act can get fined $10,000 and spend up to 2 years in jail for the first conviction, and subsequent convictions have even steeper penalties. So again, not something you want to be guessing on, not something you want to be fudging on. Violations of the Clean Water Act just in general have a potentially very steep price tag. Negligent violations of the Clean Water Act can result in fines of up to $25,000 a day, imprisonment for a year or both, and knowing violations. So, you did wrong and you knew what was going on and did it anyway, have fines up to $50,000 a day. So getting afoul of this can quickly bankrupt a system. So just, the stick that goes along with the carrot, you want to make sure that you are filling forms out correctly and not running into violations. So again, something to think about is who's actually running the NPDES program in your particular state and in the area where the plant you're working at is. Like I said, states might handle it off tribal land, and PDES permitting on tribal land is typically handled by the EPA. But again, there is this primacy thing. And so if a state has decided they want to step up and take this over, there's a process whereby they can essentially go to the EPA administrator. And if that is approved, the state program is approved, basically what happens there is the EPA stops issuing the permits and hands over issuing and enforcement to the state. So One of the prerequisites, of course, is that the state program has to be at least as stringent as the EPA's. So at a bare minimum, you'll be held to the exact same standards. You're just talking to a different agency on the regular, but they may be a little more stringent. This is the most recent map I could find that kind of lays out which states have primacy and which don't. So you can see, for example, our current state, New Mexico, where I'm at, as well as most of the territories, don't have any authority for the surface water discharges. EPA handles that stuff directly. They don't have primacy. On the other hand, Alaska, Oregon, most of the states that are covered by the Southern Eastern Tribes actually are fully authorized with state programs. So basically the state is the agency that is issuing that NPDES permit. They're also the ones that are enforcing it, although in all cases, the EPA can kind of show up when they want to and verify that things are going okay. So, good idea, again, depending on which exam you are taking, to understand very clearly, particularly if you're taking a state certification exam, who's controlling what in your state and where the overlap is. Because, for example, in some cases, there's biosolids programs included in this, and other cases there aren't. And you can find that information on the EPA's website as well. So, for example, in Texas, they've got primacy. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ, covers this. They handle all of the enforcement and the permitting. In Colorado, it's the Department of Public Health and Environment. Although the EPA issues permits for federally owned facilities and on tribal lands. In New Mexico, it's all EPA all the time because our state doesn't get involved in that. I mentioned that there were some interesting quirks about some tribal land issues. One, for example, Navajo Nation is very big. It extends across a couple of states, even though almost half of the Navajo Nation is in the state of New Mexico. Since it's tribal land, the EPA is handling it, but it's actually EPA Region 9, which includes Arizona, that issues those permits. So even though some of those permitted facilities are in the state of New Mexico, all of the permitting works through the Pacific Southwest region, Region 9. So again, just good to know, so that you know that you're talking to the right people when you have questions about your exam, your permit. And if you are taking a state-specific exam, you know who's got authority for what. And again, each of the state websites clearly lists what they cover and what they don't. So here's, just a couple of examples from California, Arizona. Each state is going to be a little bit different, but it's a good thing to look at, particularly, again, if you're taking a state-specific exam, because some states use slightly different terminology. So, for example, in California, for some reason, they call NPDES permits waste discharge requirements as well. So they have sort of two terms for it that they use interchangeably. So in your particular jurisdiction, there might be some vocabulary that you need to know just in case a question pops up using sort of the local colloquial term. And as I said, even if the state is involved, nothing in the Clean Water Act or in the handover of responsibility to the states prevents the state from actually enforcing requirements that are more stringent or more extensive than the Clean Water Act regs, the NPDES permit general regs. So they can have a greater scope. And the overlap can be kind of interesting. So for example, in Colorado, the CTPHE, Department of Public Health and Environment, they issue discharge permits for both discharges into surface water and groundwater, and their rules cover all state water specifically, including groundwater, which is different than some other states. Here in New Mexico, state focuses on the groundwater side of things, and the feds focus on the drinking water source. They also have slightly different definitions, a broader definition of what a point source is in California. And they gave some specific examples, including a bulldozer, which I thought was kind of interesting, and also, mine adits and seeps. So again, there may be some minor quirks to local definitions of point sources and which waters are covered by permitting if your state has primacy, because again, they are allowed to make slightly more stringent rules. But in general, if your state has primacy, the state agency is handling the surface water permitting and the groundwater permitting. It's typically a slightly different permitting process, but typically it's going to be the same agency that is covering both. It's just that, for the surface water, they're basically acting in the place of the EPA. And if your state does not have primacy, if you're like New Mexico, the situation looks basically like this. Groundwater's discharges is going to be handled locally, whereas the federal EPA is going to be handling the discharge permitting. As I said, I can't cover every state, but I want to point out that there are these differences. So I'm going to use my home state here in New Mexico as an example. We have two completely different regulatory schemes here. And as I said, two completely different enforcement agencies. EPA does surface water, New Mexico Environment Department, NMED does groundwater. So there's two sets of laws, two sets of regulations enforced by two different agencies. And if you're taking the New Mexico specific wastewater exam, you've got to understand the basics of both. So again, a lot of this depends on which exam you're trying to pass, which, just to jump back to the very first session, is why it's really important to review those need to knows for your particular exam, because they'll tell you what you need to cover. So in our state example here, New Mexico basically has a parallel permitting and enforcement system that covers groundwater discharges, because we don't have a lot of rivers here. So most discharge from wastewater treatment plants goes into evaporation lagoons or something similar. And although there are some systems that have lagoons and discharges. In New Mexico's case, you're responsible for knowing a specific code section. And here it's 20.6.2 of the NMAC. It's where the groundwater regulations are. That's one of the questions that sometimes pops up. Where are they in the regs? But again, like all of these things, the state agencies are very, very good at laying out exactly who's covered, and the permit that you're operating with lays out very, very clearly what you're responsible for, when you're supposed to report, etc. So this is a shot from the NMED website. There's a different discharge permit application, although NMED basically works under the same sort of framework as the feds, in that the permittee is the one who is responsible for making sure that it gets renewed, on that, I believe, 5-year schedule in New Mexico here as well. So, one big takeaway, the permittee is responsible for not only keeping to the terms of the permit and reporting anything that goes wrong, but they're also responsible for making sure that they are renewed. Like the federal rules, state rules will typically have discharge plans that basically govern what you can and cannot do, and specifically state who gets covered. So groundwater discharge plans, again, covered by NMED. They apply to specific systems, i.e. ones that are discharging over 2,000 gallons per day. Like I said, most of the systems here in New Mexico operate under discharge plans, but not all of them, and some of them have both discharge and PDES. Same as the federal system, we've got a 5-year revolving schedule, renewal schedule. And again, there are some quirks here. Since we're doing groundwater discharge, one of the components of many permits here in New Mexico are groundwater monitoring. So that might be part of your permit as well. And, like other permits, in some cases, they make exceptions to quality standards, but you have to know what the minimum standards are. It's a slightly different set of codes, but they spell out very clearly what samples have to be monitored, what has to be analyzed, what methodologies have to be used. In New Mexico's case, big facilities that have their own labs are sometimes permitted to analyze their own samples, but most small and medium-sized dischargers actually use contract labs. But there's also monitoring reports like the federal scheme. So it's essentially a parallel scheme with slightly different application. So like I said, here in New Mexico, most systems operate under these discharge plans. In New Mexico, you need to know the regs for both OpCert in your particular state. Things may be a little bit different, but again, that's where those need to knows really come into play. So, as I mentioned, EPA always has the ability to come in and enforce, even when it's been authorized to the state. So, there's always the potential possibility that the EPA is going to step in or want to come and look. They are allowed to collect inspections, and even in states where the state implements NPDES. So that's a really broad overview of what's really going to be most important for the exam component. There are other provisions, like I said, to the NPDES, many of which don't apply to wastewater treatment plants, although that there are some that are. There is a national pretreatment program that's focused on indirect dischargers. It's basically stopping toxic discharges upstream of your treatment works that could impair treatment, which are sort of applied as needed, as applicable. Sludge disposal from wastewater treatment plants is regulated under 40 CFR 503. It's a good number to remember. Basically, there's two kinds of activity that it covers: beneficial use, which is essentially land application, and disposal, which is basically getting rid of it, either going into a landfill, as opposed to being applied on the land, or incinerating. Here in New Mexico, landfill disposal is actually covered under the New Mexico regs. So again, this is one of those, your mileage may vary, your system or situation may be a little bit different. But again, how much of this you really need to know for the test depends on which test you're taking, but it is really, like I said, a really good idea to get a clear understanding of what the regulatory framework is in your particular state. And like I said, these things are covered. Some things to take away, just the basics of what the sludge requirements cover: pathogen reduction, vector attraction reduction, so making sure that vermin aren't attracted to the site, heavy metal and other pollution limitations, land application, and how long things can be stored. This is something that a lot of smaller systems get in trouble with. They sort of store the dried sludge indefinitely, which is a big no-no. So with that, I got a couple of questions we're going to go through to see how we're feeling about this. And then we'll open the floor to any questions, and then we'll take a quick break, and then Matt will come back and talk about OSHA. So our first poll, under NPDES regs, what BOD values can treatment plant effluent not exceed for the 30 and 7-day averages respectively? So is it 45 for 30 and 50 for 70? Is it 50-30? Is it 30-45? What do you think? All right, give it another 5 seconds. And then if you want to end the poll, Matt, and show the results. All right, so the correct answer is the third one there. It's the 30-45, so 30 milligrams per liter for a 30-day average and 45 milligrams for the 7-day average. Basically what that is implying is that there may be spikes here and there over that time period. We don't expect everything to stay constant, but we want the long-term average to be lower than the short-term average. So it's 30-45 and 30-day average and 7-day average. So good job, everybody. On to the next one. What does NPDES actually stand for? Got 4 options or 3 options there. All righty. It's the middle one, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. Although there is an enforcement component to it, the goal here is elimination. So the correct answer is National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. Let's go on to number 3. We're doing good here. What kind of discharges does the NPDES system cover? Is it groundwater, surface water, both, or neither? All right, so it's actually surface water discharges. The NPDES permit system is waters of the United States, surface water discharges from point sources. States typically cover groundwater discharges, although I will admit it is sometimes a little confusing because sometimes the same state agency is responsible both for NPDES permits and groundwater permits, but they are two separate permits, two separate tracks. So the NPDES permit system is focused on surface water discharges. Got 2 more questions. So how long is a permit typically valid for, and who is responsible for renewal? All right, so it's 5 years, and now that I think about it, I actually worded this a little bit goofily because, of course, the EPA is the one who's actually going to renew the permit, but the person that's responsible for actually submitting the renewal application is the permittee. So I'll accept both of those answers because I actually wrote the question poorly. But it is, yeah, it's valid for 5 years, and pretty much all the responsibility for making sure that the new renewal application goes in is on the permit holder.
All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. So thanks, James, so much for talking about the NPDES permitting process as well as the Clean Water Act regulations. And so we're going to round out things today by going in a completely different direction. We're going to talk about wastewater safety and OSHA and how all those regulations play into the job that you have to do. This is probably something that we should have talked about earlier in this wastewater operator certification webinar series, but we're doing it now because safety is a super important topic. As wastewater operators, it's important to keep safety foremost in your minds when you're on the job because it's paramount. You're going to face work situations that include safety hazards, some of which will be obvious and some of which aren't. We want you to be aware of safety issues and make sure that you keep yourself, your coworkers, and your community safe so that you can have a long and prosperous career in the wastewater treatment field because we need operators. We don't want to lose any operators. So every workplace has some risk of injury. When we look at wastewater operations, there's risk of, physical injury from machinery, improper lifting and slipping, infectious diseases, confined spaces, oxygen deficiency or enrichment, toxic vapors, gases, and chemicals, radiological hazards, explosive gas mixtures, fires, electrical shock, noise, traffic, dust, drowning, or any number of known and unknown hazards. Of course, the purpose is not to scare you away, but to make sure you take the risks seriously and help create a safe working environment. Obviously, we can't cover every safety issue in this webinar, but we do want to highlight some critical areas that you should be familiar with. As always, look at your state-specific regulatory programs to understand the requirements. And as we'll see, some rules may be stricter in your jurisdiction than they are in others. If you want to learn more about wastewater safety, much of the Sacramento State Wastewater Program's Operation of Wastewater Treatment Plants manual is devoted to safety. In fact, the entire second chapter is devoted to safety, and each section dealing with different treatment processes has its own safety section. As you do your work, you should view your surroundings with your hazard eyes on. Look out for those risks and those hazards, and then take your training and address them and make sure that you're working in a safe environment. While management's responsibility is to provide a safe place of employment, if they don't know about a safety issue, then they can't take appropriate action to address it and create a safe work environment. It is the operator that has the primary responsibility for their own safety. If you see a situation that is unsafe, you need to let others know so that it can be handled before someone is hurt. So don't be the headline, right? Because no one wants to be a headline. People are often bad at assessing risk and overconfident in outcomes particularly when prior risky behavior hasn't led to negative consequences. This is especially true when there's an emergency. This is why there are SOPs and PEP and safety training to help make sure we do the right thing in these situations. Different aspects of your work have different hazards associated with them. For example, in a lift station or wet well, you run risk of injury from slipping, confined spaces, electrical hazards, and others. Where there are excavations, there are dangers associated with cave-ins, flooding, equipment, and other hazards. It's really important that you, as operators, recognize the safety issues that you may face in each situation. They're going to vary, and as operators, particularly when you're working for a small system, you've got to be a jack of all trades. You're responsible to yourself, your employer, your coworkers, your community, and the communities downstream of you. So did you know that most utility injuries are caused by the injured employee? That means that PEP, a safety program, and training could make that injury preventable. All right, let's go and we're going to look at our first poll question. All right, so operators can experience physical injuries caused by moving machinery, improper lifting, slippery surfaces, or all of the above. And you're like, oh, if this was the OpCert test, that'd be easy. I know this one. Yeah, all of us know that any of these situations uh, can give you physical injuries, and we probably been in some of them ourselves. Before we talk about safely working in a wastewater environment, let's take a few minutes to talk about how workplace safety is regulated in the U.S. At the federal level, the implementation and enforcement of occupational safety and health regulations falls under OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which is part of the U.S. Department of Labor. The administration was created in late 1970 when President Nixon signed the Occupational Safety and Health Act. This act covers most private sector employers and their workers, in addition to some public sector employers and workers in the 50 states and certain U.S. territories, and those jurisdictions that fall under federal authority and not under a state program. Of course, there are a lot of different kinds of legal entities that run wastewater treatment facilities, right? You've got some private, you've got some public, but as an operator, you are responsible for having a basic understanding of the regulatory environment in which you are working. Note that although we're showing the OSHA logo here, this is not an OSHA sponsored or supported webinar. OSHA's mission is to assure safe and healthy working conditions for working men and women by setting and enforcing standards and by providing training, outreach, education, and assistance. The Occupational Safety and Health Act covers most private sector employers in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and other U.S. jurisdictions, either directly through the federal OSHA or through an OSHA-approved state plan. Like the EPA's NPDES program, which James just talked about, in some jurisdictions, state agencies have taken on the responsibility for enforcing occupational health and safety. Those approved state programs effectively take the place of OSHA, but are approved and monitored by and partially funded by OSHA. So the federal government still has overall responsibility, but they do delegate primacy to these state approved programs. So the following 22 states and Puerto Rico have OSHA approved state programs. So I don't know if you see your state up there. I don't recognize a lot of state flags anymore. You know, as a kid, I used to know all of them. I could probably go through, and now I look at them and I'm wondering, oh gosh, who does that belong to? So we won't go through the list, but if you see your state flag up here, then they have an OSHA approved state program. And of course, we're working on tribal reservations and at tribal wastewater facilities, and it's going to be a mixed bag. A lot of tribal programs will follow under the federal OSHA program. 5 additional states and the U.S. Virgin Islands have OSHA-approved state plans that cover public sector workers only. And so we've got Connecticut, Illinois, Maine, New Jersey, New York, and the Virgin Islands there. So be aware of your local occupational safety and health regulations. Not all states or U.S. territories have those OSHA-approved programs implementing the federal regulations, but most, if not all states, have their own agencies that regulate occupational safety. And their regulations or recommendations may, in some cases, going to be more stringent than the federal OSHA. The good thing is those kinds of differences will typically be pointed out in your state-specific testing and study materials. Well, let's talk a bit about safety programs because safety is everyone's concern. According to the OSHA regulations, all wastewater utilities, regardless of size, must have a safety program to systematically address workplace safety and health hazards on an ongoing basis to reduce the extent and severity of work-related injuries and illnesses. And while this may be the requirement, it's not always met in our small tribal communities. A good safety program should identify the causes of accidents, illnesses, and injuries. It should provide safety training. It should implement an accident reporting system. All right, and it needs to hold supervisors responsible for implementing the safety program. And this last bullet is important because if only the employees and the safety officer are held responsible, the program is likely to fail. So as operators, you've got the most to gain because you're the most likely to be injured. So you should ask about your employer's safety program and participate in it. You should follow safety protocols and standards when you're doing your job. You should use safety equipment like SCBA, hard hats, goggles, gloves, and other PPE. And you should report safety hazards and injuries. And so this last bullet's important. If you see something, say something. When it comes to safety, it's management's responsibility to develop a written safety statement and establish that safety program. They need to assign responsibilities for injury prevention. They need to appoint a safety officer or a coordinator. They need to establish realistic safety goals and revise them to encourage continual improvement. And they should evaluate safety program results. And so again, this last point is crucial. The only way to know something is effective is if you track and measure the outcomes. This is why all injuries should be reported and why we have reporting programs. Okay, so when it comes to a safety program, there should be 3 training components. You need to safely educate. You need to have safety education, for all employees. You need to have reinforced education and safety. You have to have safety education and the use of tools and equipment. And to put it another way, really, it's about education, education, education. Safety, it's not a once and done kind of thing. Safety orientations for new operators, ongoing training and safety reinforcement, particularly with job duties as they are learned. There are different considerations for different situations, and there will be specialized training required for working in confined spaces, water-filled structures, and other hazardous areas. There are going to be risks that you aren't aware of, and continuing education will help with developing and maintaining safety awareness. All right, well, tailgates, they aren't just for parties and barbecue at the game. they're a great place for safety meeting. Tailgate meetings can be part of ongoing safety training or the start of work at a new job site. These meetings make sure safety is foremost in everyone's mind. Hazards are identified and everyone has an opportunity to ask questions and get on the same page. There's a hierarchy of controls to safety to control hazardous workplace situations. While this diagram is from the CDC, it can be applied to safety in the wastewater workplace too. The least effective measures are at the bottom, and the most effective measures here are going to be at the top. PPE, safety glasses, hard hats, protective shoes, and gloves is part of this hierarchy of controls. Administrative controls, changing the way people work through safety training programs is next. Engineering controls, so physical controls like railings and guards is next in the hierarchy. Administrative controls, so changing the way people, substitution. I'm going opposite here. Substitution, if you can replace the hazard with something else that's not as hazardous, then that should be done and looked at. So like if you can replace manual sampling with automatic sampling, then that's a substitution of the hazard. And then finally, elimination. Can you physically remove the hazard so it no longer is there? And so looking at this hierarchy of controls and how effective they are and implementing these as part of a safety program is important. So that's a brief overview of safety program basics. So let's change gears a bit and talk about some specific safety related topics. But before we do, let's have another poll. All right, and so let's go ahead and get that going. Who has the most to gain from a safety program? Is it management? Is it the office staff? Is it the operators, or is it the supervisors? All right. Most of us chose operators, and that's correct because operators are most likely to be injured. Everyone benefits from a safety program, but it's the frontline employees that are going to benefit the most. All right, so let's talk about infectious materials. So one of the hazards we have working in a wastewater environment are infectious materials. And so all those bugs we work with, all the bugs that are in wastewater, like bacteria, this is cholera in the picture right here, protozoans, viruses, helminths, which are like parasitic worms, or other parasites, can get in our bodies and cause infections. And so it's important that you talk to your safety officer. If you're not already inoculated for, you should look at being inoculated for typhoid, paratyphoid, polio, hepatitis A and B, and tetanus. All of these are waterborne diseases that are found in wastewater. And when you're working in a wastewater environment, it's a good idea to assume that all surfaces are contaminated. Another way to deal with infectious material in wastewater is to use PPE, and in this case, gloves should be used anytime you handle hazardous samples or you may come into contact with wastewater or sludge. I also wanted to bring up some talk about water safety. Working in a wastewater environment, water safety is important. Water is a direct part of working in wastewater, and we have to create an environment that mitigates that hazard as much as possible. And so when we talk about water safety, we want to make sure to reduce slip hazards on catwalks, around clarifiers and basins. We want to use extra caution in wet and icy environments. We want to keep handrails in good repair and replace any damaged rails. We want to mark and guard unsafe areas with guardrails, rope, chains, or cable. We want to station emergency gear near filters, tanks, basins, and clarifiers. emergency gear would be approved safety vests, buoys, and life poles. And if we don't know how to, we should probably learn how to swim. But we still should be using those personal flotation devices where appropriate, even if you can swim. All right, so let's do another poll here. So if you fall into an active aeration basin, will you always be able to swim out? Yes or no? All right, most of us said no. You won't always be able to get out. Some of us said, yeah, you can get out. Maybe you're a good swimmer, or maybe you always wear your personal flotation device. But really, the answer we're looking for is no. Aeration tanks involve more danger due to aeration mixing equipment and currents in the tank. In addition, aeration reduces buoyancy and makes it difficult to float. If the blowers are going full blast and you aren't wearing a PFD, a personal flotation device, there's a good chance you're going to sink like a rock. And so I don't know if you all saw Mythbusters a long time ago. They looked at this question about staying afloat in an aeration basin. And, even with a PFD on, it is difficult if those blowers are going full blast. So in a wastewater treatment plant, there are lots of electrical hazards, and as we know, electricity and water don't mix. So this is another topic that we want to focus on. Utilities have equipment with all kinds of voltages and amps, everything from 120, 220, 440 up to kilovoltage ranges, depending on your equipment. This includes transformers, starters, motors, instrumentation, and control panels. And so let's do another question here. All right, let's see how safety savvy you are. So the question is, can 120 volts kill you? Yes or no? I mean, as a kid, I used to always, for some reason, end up shocking myself when I plugged in a plug. I always hated that feeling. So I didn't die yet, or maybe, who knows? So can 120 volts kill you? All right, let's see what everybody says. We'll share those results. Yeah, so most of us said yes, 120 volts can kill you. Um, and so, what is the answer? Yeah, 120 volts can kill you, and even 12 volts can injure you. And when we think about this, we have to think about how current and voltage are related. This is something called Ohm's law, and you should be familiar with Ohm's law when you work with electricity. And um, so Ohm's law tells us that current equals voltage divided by resistance. That's that top equation. Another way to write this law is amps equals voltage divided by ohms. All right. You've probably heard of the phrase that it's the amps that will kill you. Let's look to see this in action and what the outcomes could be. All right, so first thing we need to know is about how resistance plays a role in our body. And so when we talk about resistance ear to ear, we don't have too much resistance. It's only 100 ohms ear to ear. But when we're talking about hand to foot resistance in the human body is 500 ohms. Dry skin has a lot more resistance than wet skin has as well. So if you have wet skin, all of that resistance is going to go down. Here's a situation, okay? Resistance in the body, ear to ear, remember it's 100 ohms. And so if we're shocked ear to ear with 120 volts, we go ahead and plug in this into our equation, our Ohm's law, 120 volts divided by 100 ohms of resistance, and we get 1.2 amps of current. And so in this case, the outcome at 120 volts is going to be instant death. Here's another example of resistance in the body. If we get shocked hand to foot, and we have current travel through from hand to foot, that's a 500 ohm resistance, which is common. Sometimes you're touching something and it grounds out on the floor at your foot. If we plug this into Ohm's law, 120 volts divided by 500 ohms of resistance, and our current comes out to 240 milliamps. That outcome, severe burns, possible death, but probably not likely. So when we work with electricity, we want to follow some basic safe electrical practices. We want to be proactive in our maintenance to identify performance and safety issues with our electrical equipment. We want to use non-conductive tools when working around electricity. We don't want to use electrical equipment with worn or frayed cords. And permanent wiring should be installed with conduit or armored cable by an electrician. We want to replace connections with worn or thinning insulation. We want to make sure to ground that equipment with three-pronged plugs. We need to be alert for overheating equipment or tingling. Any electrical units that are operated in areas exposed to flammable vapors, they should be explosion proof. And it's important to work in pairs to service, repair, or troubleshoot electrical equipment. One of the best ways to avoid accidental electrocutions and equipment accidents is by using a lockout and tagout procedure. The basics of lockout and tagout program include notifying affected employees that the lockout tagout procedure will be used and why. Shutting down equipment using normal shutdown process or procedures. And then we isolate the equipment from energy sources and ensure any stored energy is dissipated. We have some capacitors in some of our starters and other places, and so we need to make sure to de-energize those capacitors. Lock out and tag out the energy isolating device with the assigned individual lock and tag. And then confirm the circuit's dead. Ensure energy source is disconnected after ensuring no personnel are exposed. And then now the work can begin. Everything's locked out and tagged out. After work is complete, all the tools are removed and everything is returned to working order. We ensure all employees are clear, and then we remove lockout and tagout devices. And then we can notify affected employees that lockout and tagout have been removed and restored power to the equipment. And real quick, we're running a little bit late here, but I did want to share with you a recent accident that happened at a place where someone I know works. So this place has a lockout tagout program, and employees receive continued training on the program. On the day of the accident, an auger screw that carries waste product away, it became clogged. An employee shut down the equipment, but they didn't follow the lockout tagout procedure. They didn't notify everyone they were going to be doing maintenance on the equipment, and they did not de-energize the equipment. And they didn't do the lockout tagout of the equipment. So they began trying to unclog the auger and had reached into it to move material out of the way. While they were doing this, another employee started up the equipment again. The employee that was doing the maintenance had their arm caught by the auger. It tried to pull them into the equipment and they couldn't get loose, and they had their arm ripped off at the shoulder. Their jaw was crushed before they managed to get free or before other employees pulled them free. It's an awful accident, but the point is it's up to us as individuals to follow our training and use SOPs to prevent accidents like this from happening. Um, and so let's look. We had a good question up there. Who is responsible for removal of the lockout tagout equipment? So let's run our last poll here and let's see what you all think. Who should remove locks and tags from electrical equipment? Is it the operator who needs to use the equipment next? Is the operator who locked and tagged out the equipment? Any operator that's qualified as an electrician, or any operator on the next shift? What do you all think? Who should remove that lockout, tagout equipment? Let's share those results. So most of us said the operator who locked The operator who locked and tagged out the equipment. And that's correct. Okay. It's the person who locked and tagged out the equipment. The one caveat that I wanted to share with that is you should never remove lockout and tagout equipment that someone else installed unless your employer has specific procedures and training for removal by others. So it all depends on your safety program. Everybody that takes part in that safety program, they need to follow the same procedures. Okay. Let's talk about chemical hazards because there can be a lot of potentially dangerous chemicals in a wastewater treatment plant that can, if handled incorrectly, cause accidents and cause exposures with chronic and acute effects. It's good to understand the chemistry of substances you are working with, how to store them, use them safely, and how they can potentially affect you or others, and what to do in the event of an exposure. Knowing characteristics like boiling point, flammability, explosive limits, reactivity, and first aid for each chemical you use is important. Some of the chemical hazards that you may experience with wastewater treatment include burns, respiratory damage, eye damage, rashes, skin damage, headaches, and even death. Um, Chemical hazards can cause acute and chronic health effects. Acute effects occur with chemical contact and usually resolve when no longer in contact or with medical treatment. This includes things like eye irritation and blurred vision from chlorine exposure that might clear up when you're in the fresh air. Chronic effects are long-term effects that may not appear immediately or after a single exposure. These effects may or may not be reversible. For example, coughing and wheezing from long-term low-level exposure to chlorine. Take note that chemical hazards can have acute effects, chronic effects, or both. Some hazards have immediate impact while others will creep up on you through repeated exposure. Acids get used a lot in treatment processes and wastewater, and they're also used for cleaning. They can react violently if exposed to alkaline materials like ammonium nitrate or potassium hydroxide. PPE like splash-proof goggles and a face shield are a must when working with acids. Bases are typically used in wastewater treatment to raise the pH of the water. They can attack human tissue quickly and can cause burns. They can have explosive reaction when they come in contact with acids. Splash-proof goggles should be worn at all times due to the strong hazard bases present to eyesight. A note that quicklime there, the second bullet, won't explode, but it does generate a lot of heat when mixed with water. Here are some other chemicals you're likely to encounter with wastewater treatment. All right, and so we use a lot of different chemicals in wastewater treatment. And because of that, and because so many different chemicals are used, and these chemicals are used throughout multiple different industries, there's got to be a common method for identifying and communicating these chemical hazards. In the US, the system is referred to as NFPA 704, which is the standard system for the identification of the hazards of materials for emergency response. So people that are doing emergency response knows the hazards associated with it. And you should become familiar with how they work and what these different areas mean. And so if we look at health hazard, it's always indicated here in this square or in this diamond on the left side. It's always in blue. If the health hazard is deadly, it's going to be marked with a 4. If it's slightly hazard, then it'll be a 1. At the top, always marked with a red is going to be your fire hazard. Okay, and so is it hazardous at below 25 degrees Celsius? It's going to be marked with a 4. If it's not flammable or no fire hazard, then it's going to be with a 0. Reactivity is always on the right, and it always has a yellow square. Uh, a 4 is the highest hazard with reactivity. That means it may detonate. If it's marked with a 0, it's stable. And then in the bottom box, we always have our specific hazards. And so OXY means it's an oxidizer. We get the radioactive waste symbol. If There should not be any water used when dealing with this hazard. Then it's going to have a W with a line through it. Okay, and sometimes, a lot of times, if you see a semi truck carrying hazardous chemicals, they're going to have this hazard communication, this NFPA 704 symbol on the side of the truck. OSHA also has the hazard communication standard, which requires pictograms on labels to alert users of the chemical hazards to which they may be exposed. Each pictogram consists of a symbol on a white background framed within a red border, and it represents a distinct hazard. The pictogram on the label is determined by the chemical hazard classification. And so you can see on the right of the slide there the different types of hazards associated and the different types of pictograms that are used for each of those hazards. For any chemical you work with, you should be familiar and you should read the safety data sheets. Safety data sheets are all set up the same way, and at a minimum, they're going to have these different sections. So that first section identifies the chemical. All right. That second section always identifies the hazards associated with that chemical. It's going to tell you, we're looking at one for sulfuric acid. And so the third section is always going to tell you what are the ingredients in that chemical. For the most part, we just have sulfuric acid and water. What are the first aid measures you should take if you have exposure? If you have eye contact, skin contact, inhalation, you shouldn't wait until you have an accident to start reading these safety data sheets. Any chemical you work with, you should read this before working with the chemical. We also have what are the firefighting measures for that chemical, what to do in case of an accidental release, how to safely handle and store that chemical, what sorts of exposure controls and PPE should we use with that chemical, what are those physical and chemical properties, what are the stability and reactivity characteristics of that chemical, how toxic is it, how it does when it's released into the environment and what are the concerns with that, how to dispose of it, how to transport it, and finally, regulatory information. Oh, not finally, we also have other information at the back, if there's any other information. All right, so let's talk about chlorine real quick. Here's a chlorine gas disinfection system. It uses a 1-ton cylinder. Other smaller systems use 150-pound upright cylinders. Chlorine's a chemical that's commonly used in wastewater treatment, so you should be familiar with its properties and its hazard, because we really don't want to get chlorine in our eyes. We don't want to get it in our lungs. You know, it can do permanent damage in our lungs if we inhale it. Our lungs don't heal easily, or they won't heal at all. And chlorine exposure, gas chlorine exposure, can kill you. And so here's a table that shows the health effects of chlorine gas exposure based on how much of it is in the air. The values in the column on the left are in parts per million. That bolded row at the top is an OSHA ceiling limit of 1 part per million. Now, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, NEOSH, recommended exposure limit is half of that, and it's a weighted average for a 10-hour workday. Now, most people, they can detect chlorine at very low concentrations. You see that 0.3 to 3.5 parts per million. But chlorine also deadens your sense of smell, so you may not notice it after a while. We already talked about chlorine storage and hazards pretty much in depth during the disinfection webinar, so I'm not going to go over that again here, but I do want to use chlorine as a framework, an example for talking about safety equipment. Okay, so you need to know your safety equipment. You need to know where it is, how and when to use it, and importantly, how to maintain it. A respirator like this just filters out the chlorine gas and protects your eyes. So if there's a leak, you have PPE to get you out of there right away. But this kind of PPE is for escape purposes only because it's what's not in the room that can kill you just as easily as what is. And so if what's missing is oxygen, then that can kill you just as easily as the chlorine gas. So never go into an area where chlorine gas is present with a canister gas mask. Uh, it's really for escape purposes only. And that's because chlorine can displace the air in the room. And if oxygen level drops below 12%, you could die. There's not enough oxygen to sustain you, even though the chlorine is all getting filtered out by your gas mask. This is also the reason why you never want to crawl out of a room when there's a chlorine leak, if you can avoid it, because chlorine sinks to the floor and displaces the air that's there. By going to the floor, you may actually be putting yourself in an oxygen depleted area and you may pass out before you realize the danger. Again, this is about knowing what to do in a given situation, what equipment to use and how to use it. If you were in a structure fire where the room is full of smoke, you'd want to hit the floor to crawl out because smoke rises. This is not the case with a chlorine gas leak. Also, side note, all PPEs got to be maintained. Chlorine gas mask canisters must be changed every 6 months or when exposed to chlorine. This is the sort of maintenance safety program would cover. An SCBA system provides you with an air supply and blocks the chlorine, at least for a limited time when you have an air supply. But they take training to use and require maintenance, and you can't have facial air that gets in the way of the mask seal. You also must be stored outside the chlorine room so you don't have to enter it to get the SCBA. Poorly maintained or located PPE and rescue equipment can be worse than none because you may have a false sense of security without understanding the risk associated with using it. All right, so let's talk about confined spaces now. Another hazard that is common with wastewater systems. So all confined spaces have the following in common. They're large enough and configured so that an employee can bodily enter and perform work. They have limited or restricted means for entry and exit. They're not designed for continuous occupancy. Every entry into a confined space requires a confined space entry permit to ensure that a supervisor or other qualified person has taken the appropriate safety measures prior to entry. Examples of confined spaces in wastewater include tanks, manholes, vessels, storage bins, pits, and vaults. So confined space hazards, air contamination. It could be flammable. It could be explosive. It could be toxic. Maybe the oxygen is deficient in that confined space atmosphere. Maybe it's an enriched oxygen environment, which could increase the explosion risk. And also we have to think about explosive chemical dust in confined spaces. Manholes, they are confined spaces. They have limited openings for entry and exit. They have unfavorable natural ventilation. Deadly gases can accumulate or oxygen can be displaced. So they require air quality to be monitored and be ventilated. They're not designed for continuous worker occupancy. One thing to note is that corrosive gases in the sewer, they can cause steps to deteriorate, so be careful when you're using those steps in manholes. With wastewater systems, you run into confined spaces all the time during maintenance, and you must follow the regs and SOPs to stay safe. Sometimes it's what's there that hurts or kills you. Sometimes it's what's not there. Oxygen deficiency can be as deadly as being exposed to a toxic gas. So let's look at some oxygen facts. Normal air that we breathe is 20.9% oxygen. Below 19.5% oxygen, a potentially dangerous condition exists. At 17% oxygen, you're going to experience shortness of breath. At 6 to 10% oxygen, rapid loss of consciousness occurs. And then below 6% oxygen, death occurs within minutes. So what can cause oxygen deficiency in confined spaces? Well, the bacteria in that confined space, their action, they can use up that available oxygen. You can get displacement of oxygen by other gases. There could be toxic like chlorine or hydrogen sulfide gases, or they could be inert like nitrogen. Oxidation of metals or other materials, it depletes oxygen. So when iron rusts, it uses oxygen to do that, so it can use it up. You can also get the absorption of oxygen onto surfaces, and combustion can create oxygen deficiency in confined environments. I know that we're right at 3 o'clock right here. I'm just going to go through a little bit more to finish things up. It shouldn't take too long. So multi-gas monitors and confined space entry checklists and permits are your friends. Note that exact procedures for confined space entry can vary between agencies and locations, so confirm the local rules with the appropriate regulatory safety agency. Real quick, we're going to talk about excavation hazards. When there is a collapse in a trench without adequate cave-in protection, there is usually no warning and no time to escape. OSHA requires cave-in protection when a trench is 5 feet deep or more. Now, here is where it's different. New Mexico Environment Department recommends protection if an excavation is 4 feet deep or more. So this is a reminder to check your local requirements. In some cases, they may be stricter than the federal requirements. There are 3 basic ways to protect trenches from cave-ins: shoring, shielding, and sloping. Shoring uses wood or a metal framework to support the walls of the trench. In this case, we're using wood. It takes a lot of work to put that in place, but it's a very effective cave-in protection. Here's a metal box or metal framework to support the walls of this trench. Okay, so that's shoring. Shielding is done with 2-sided steel trench boxes, as shown here. This one's on its side. The key to staying safe with trench boxes is staying in between the box, between the plates. Notice that the fellow in the middle is not between the plates. In addition, there can't be big gaps between the trench wall and the trench box. If there are, and there is a cave-in, the trench box could collapse. And so you can see here, we don't have much distance between the trench box and the wall. And so, if there is a cave-in, it should be protected from collapse. And last but not least, we have sloping, which is what's going on in this picture. The sides of the trench are sloped in a manner to reduce the likelihood of cave-in by removing the trench wall itself. The acceptable slope angle is 34 degrees or a slope of 1.5 to 1, run over rise. And what this means is you need to have 1.5 feet of horizontal excavation for every foot of vertical on both sides of the trench. So let's look at a real world kind of example here. We have our trench. It's a 5-foot deep trench. That means it needs 7.5 feet of run on each side of the trench to effectively remove the trench wall. That means you need to have an excavation that's over 15 feet wide, plus the width of the trench, not to mention space to put the spoils. As you do the math in your head, you can quickly see why other options may be more cost effective and, in some cases, may be the only option possible. Ladders, they're required every 25 lateral feet. They have to extend at least 3 feet above the excavation wall, and they have to be placed on firm ground within the trench. So don't be a headline because, again, no one wants to be a headline. Every one of these listed accidents happened because the workers in question weren't following the rules, didn't use adequate protection, and almost all the person who was trapped died. As we said at the beginning, people are often bad at assessing risk and overconfident in outcomes, particularly when prior risky behavior hasn't led to negative consequences, or in cases where there's an emergency. This is why there are SOPs and PEP and safety training to help make sure we do the right thing in these situations. So there are other hazards that we did not cover today. You need to study available materials for your program and for your regulating agency. Follow that safety program and primarily use your head. All right. Well, thanks so much. That completes our session for today.